Welcome to the John Clampett Show, episode number 14. It's another rankings reaction video. So without further ado, let's get right into it. To start, the committee, their rankings have been consistent. The criteria with which they've determined how the rankings, what order the rankings should be in, they've applied that throughout the top 25 all 3 weeks, and they're applying it equally to all of the teams. They're not changing the criteria to fixate one team in a certain spot above another. They're keeping it consistent throughout the top 25. So first off, just props to them for that. So the first topic, or the first point I want to get into is revisiting why Notre Dame is ranked ahead of BYU. That's a big topic of conversation among college football fans, why Notre Dame's ahead of BYU. BYU has just the one loss. They've got a good win over Utah. The one loss is to top 5 Texas Tech. Notre Dame has 2 losses. So the committee is valuing Notre Dame's win over USC pretty much equally to BYU's win over Utah. Where the differentiator between the two teams comes in is BYU's loss. One was more recent than Notre Dame's losses, and two, the fashion with which they lost was way less impressive. They got blown out at Texas Tech by 22 points. Notre Dame lost to 2 top 13 teams now by a combined 4 points, pretty much on the last seconds of the game. So that's why Notre Dame is valued higher than BYU is and ranked higher than BYU. Whether you agree or disagree, that's up to you. I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm just saying that's why Notre Dame is ranked higher than BYU is right now. Next one is Notre Dame and Miami. Even though Miami has the head-to-head, they're ranked behind Notre Dame. The committee came out and said yesterday, after the rankings, that at the current point in time, Miami and Notre Dame aren't being compared at all. They have Notre Dame grouped with a group of teams that they're comparing to in a tier above Miami at the moment. So there's no direct comparison, therefore head-to-head doesn't come into play yet. He did say that Miami is trending towards that direction with how they've played recently. They're inching closer to that tier where Notre Dame is with the other teams. So then head-to-head will become a factor if they can reach that tier. And now Notre Dame and Alabama, that was a big question mark coming into this week's rankings, is how would they order Oklahoma, Alabama, and Notre Dame? Oklahoma jumped up to 8, passed Alabama and Notre Dame after beating Alabama this weekend. Notre Dame stayed put at 9 after beating Pitt by 22, and Alabama dropped to 10 after losing to Oklahoma. This creates a really bad situation for Alabama and a really good situation for Notre Dame. Notre Dame has pretty much hit a ceiling as far as how far they can jump in the rankings by themselves. They need teams above them to lose if they're going to jump up in the rankings, because their remaining schedule is Syracuse and Stanford. Those are bad teams. They're not going to impress anyone by winning those games. Alabama also has a couple of bad teams left, so they're not really going to pass anyone unless they win the SEC championship game, because they got an FCS team and then Auburn left. So as far as the relation between those two teams, at 8-2, both of them are 8-2 right now. The committee has Notre Dame higher. So Alabama's not going to pass Notre Dame unless they win the SEC championship game. And right now, Alabama controls its own destiny to get to the SEC championship game still, because they only have the one conference loss, and they're ahead of Ole Miss in the standings, and they have the head-to-head in the standings over Georgia. So what's really bad for Alabama is what's behind them, with Alabama being behind Notre Dame, it creates a situation where if Alabama were to lose the SEC championship game and get a third loss, they would get passed up by teams behind them. Whether it's Miami, they went out. Right now, Alabama's the buffer between Miami and Notre Dame. The main reason why they aren't being compared directly. So Miami, if Alabama loses the SEC championship game and Miami wins out to go 10-2, Miami's not going to jump Notre Dame. They're going to jump Alabama. And if Miami ends up being ranked higher than Notre Dame's just going to bump back one, and it's going to bump Alabama out. So a 10-2 Notre Dame or an 8-2 Notre Dame is higher than 8-2 Alabama. You can confidently say that a 10-2 Notre Dame is going to be valued higher than a 10-3 Alabama. So if Miami were to jump in and end up being compared to Notre Dame, they're going to bump Notre Dame back, which is going to bump Alabama out, or they're just going to replace Alabama. USC can also win out and be 10-2, and they play Oregon this week, which is a big game where USC can really impress the committee with a win in Autzen. USC can jump in at 10-2 and bump Alabama out if they're 10-3. Michigan still has to play Ohio State. If they win out, beat Ohio State, and go 10-2, they can also jump Alabama and bump them out. So Alabama pretty much has to win the SEC to get into the college football playoff now, unless the teams behind them just lose. Notre Dame is pretty much safe. You can't call them a lock because they don't. Stuff has to happen for them to make the playoff. Is like stuff outside of them just winning games has to happen for them to make the playoff. But they're very comfortably in the playoff right now because of them being ranked ahead of Alabama in this week's rankings. Because Alabama is not going to pass Notre Dame unless Notre Dame loses or Alabama wins the SEC championship game in a few weeks. They can't pass Notre Dame in the next 2 weeks. Now, with the dilemma between Notre Dame, Alabama, and Miami, you say, well, Miami's 13, Alabama's 10. There's still two teams, BYU and Utah, between them. BYU and Utah are in a really weird spot. Utah's being blocked by BYU. So there's a ceiling there because BYU has a head-to-head win over Utah and one less loss, and it was pretty recent. So Utah is pretty much being blocked by BYU. BYU wins out there in the Big 12 championship game. If they lose that, they'll be 11-2. Utah's not going to jump BYU. A 10-2 Utah is not going to surpass an 11-2 BYU that beat them. So they're pretty much packaged together at this point, but BYU's blocking Utah. So Utah needs BYU to lose multiple games if they're going to have a chance to get into the playoffs. And they also need other teams to lose as well. So those two teams are pretty much irrelevant to the Notre Dame, Alabama, and Miami discussion. And an 11-2 BYU, since they're a 9-1 team right now and they're ranked 11th, but with auto bids and such, they're currently out of the playoffs. An 11-2 BYU isn't going to get in. They have to win the Big 12 championship to get in the playoffs. Miami's, while they can't get an auto bid right now because they don't control their own destiny, the ACC championship game, they are the highest ranked ACC team, and they're in a pretty good spot to play their way into the playoffs. Right now, you can say Alabama is probably going to drop out because I personally wouldn't be comfortable picking them to beat Texas A&M at this point. Texas A&M would probably win that game. So Alabama is probably going to be knocked out of the playoffs. I don't know if BYU would be able to beat Texas Tech. So they're out, therefore bumping Utah back as well. Miami wins out. they're going to be in the top 10. And that 10 spot is where you need to be. To being in the top 10 is really where you need to be to get an at-large spot, because the teams behind them have auto bids, whether it's the G5 teams, ACC, whatever. If USC beats Oregon this weekend, then there's going to be a whole lot of bubble chaos, because Oregon's going to be 10-2, most likely. USC is most likely going to finish 10-2. Miami's probably going to finish 10-2. Notre Dame's going to finish 10-2. Alabama's going to finish 10-2 in the regular season. BYU might finish 11-1. Utah's going to be 10-2. So that Vanderbilt is going to be 10-2, although they've kind of hit a ceiling. If they can beat Tennessee, they'll be 10-2. So that whole 9 to 14 is going to be a group of a bunch of 10-2 teams vying for one or two at-large playoff spots. So it's going to be really, really interesting to watch how the committee ranks these teams in the coming weeks, with, all these 10-2 teams most likely finishing 10-2 teams. As far as why teams are ranked where they are as a whole, this committee is valuing eye test way more than they're valuing strength of schedule or strength of record and all that. For example, the Notre Dame Alabama discussion, right? Alabama Alabama has a really strong resume. They've got 4 top 25 wins and a big win over Georgia, and then they've beat Tennessee, they've beat Missouri, they beat Vanderbilt. They also have a bad loss to Florida State in really convincing fashion, and they've got a good loss to Oklahoma. They didn't play very well in that game. Still only lost by 2. But Alabama's been very one-dimensional this year. Their defense is good. They're not great. Their passing game is excellent, but they can't run the ball at all. So if you can disrupt the passing game on their offense, then you have a really good chance of beating them. Notre Dame, on the other hand, their defense is really good, and they've only improved throughout the season. Their run game is really good, and CJ Carr and the receivers, they have a much improved passing game from last year. They're a really balanced offense. So even though Notre Dame doesn't quite have the strength of record or strength of schedule, whatever it is, to compare to Alabama, they don't have a bad loss like Florida State, and they're a much more balanced team throughout all their aspects of the team components. That's why Notre Dame is ahead of Alabama there. So yeah, pretty much to summarize, bubble chaos is going to be crazy in the coming weeks. Notre Dame is pretty much a lock for the playoff at this point. Not in the sense that they can just win out and they're in, but in the sense that what around them, what probably needs to happen around them for them to be a lock in the playoff looks likely, because they got ranked ahead of Alabama this week. BYU and Utah are packaged together. BYU is blocking Utah and pretty much has to win the Big 12 to get in. They're not going to get in 11-2. Miami is not currently being compared to Notre Dame directly. They're in a tier below in terms of teams grouped together by ranking. They're going to play themselves into that tier, but they're probably not going to replace Notre Dame in the playoffs. They're probably going to end up replacing Alabama because of the Notre Dame-Alabama ranking. That's really all I've got for this episode. If you're an Alabama fan, you should be nervous about your chances to make the playoffs because of this past week's ranking. And you may be a little upset too, depending on what you think, how you think the criteria for ranking these teams should be. But if you don't want to miss any college football content from me, hit the subscribe button, subscribe to the channel, like this video, comment below what you think is going to happen around the bubble, what your rankings would be, all that, whether you disagree, agree with my takes, disagree with the committee, whatever it is, comment down below. Engage with the channel. I try to reply to comments, so I want to see you guys talking. I want to hear your thoughts. But yeah, that's all I got. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on the John Clancy Show.